Have you ever heard of Abraxas? This enigmatic figure, revered in ancient Gnostic texts, was so powerful that the Church sought to erase his legacy. But why? Discover the untold story of Abraxas, the god who defied the Church, and how his influence continues to resonate today. There is a god the Church wants you to forget, a god of power and knowledge, who threatened the established order. His name is Abraxas, and his story is shrouded in mystery. Join us as we unravel the secrets of this forbidden deity and explore his enduring impact on history. Imagine a being so potent that the Church dedicated itself to suppressing his existence. That being is Abraxas. This video unveils the captivating mysteries surrounding this powerful figure, exploring the forbidden knowledge and ancient wisdom that continue to inspire and intrigue. Did you know there is a god so powerful that the Church literally tried to erase him from history? His name was Abraxas, and he was a being of such immense power and mystery that even the ancient Church Fathers considered him too dangerous to be spoken aloud. You're probably asking yourself, who was this mysterious figure, and why did the Church try to ban any mention of his name? To understand the story of Abraxas, we have to go back to the early days of Christianity when the religion was still in its infancy. At that time, there were many different factions within the Christian community, each with their own beliefs and practices. One of these groups was known as the Gnostics, and they had a very different understanding of God than the rest of the Christians. They believed that God was not just a spirit, but also had a physical body, and that he could be accessed through secret knowledge, or gnosis. This was a radical idea at the time, and it put them at odds with the rest of the Christian community. In an effort to distance themselves from the Gnostics and their heretical teachings, the early Church Fathers began to condemn and suppress any mention of the forbidden god. Over time, the name Abraxas became synonymous with heresy and was effectively banned from the religious and academic communities. But despite the best efforts of the Church, the legend of Abraxas has survived, and there are many people today who are fascinated by this mysterious figure. But who exactly was Abraxas, and what made him so controversial? One of the most important things to understand about Abraxas is that he is not mentioned in the Bible. In fact, there is no mention of him in any Christian texts at all. All of the information we have about him comes from Gnostic sources, which were deliberately excluded from the canon of sacred books. The word Abraxas itself is thought to be a compound of the Greek words for father and son, which would make it mean father-son. But it may also have been derived from the Babylonian word for rising sun. This is thought to be a reference to Abraxas's role as a bringer of light, a savior who comes to redeem humanity from the darkness of ignorance. In Gnostic texts, Abraxas is often depicted as a winged bull, a symbol of power and strength. He is also sometimes shown with a flame or lantern, representing his ability to bring light into darkness, and in some texts, he is described as having the face of a young man, suggesting his connection to the idea of renewal and rebirth. Some scholars believe that Abraxas was originally a pagan deity that was absorbed into Gnosticism during the early centuries AD. Others believe that he was a purely Gnostic invention, a symbolic representation of the divine spark within each human being. Whatever his origins, Abraxas quickly became one of the most important figures in Gnostic theology. He was seen as the savior of humanity, the one who would come to earth to teach the lost sheep of Israel the true nature of God. The Gnostics believed that the world was created by a lesser God, a being of darkness and ignorance who kept humanity in bondage. Through their ignorance of their true nature, Abraxas was the true God. And he was also a man like us who had come down to earth to show us the way to salvation. To the Gnostics, Abraxas represented freedom from the shackles of sin and ignorance. He was the one who would reveal the true nature of God and lead humanity out of darkness into the light. It is no wonder then that the Church Fathers considered him to be a dangerous heretic. If the Gnostics were correct, then everything the Church stood for would come crashing down round them. If God was not a spirit, but a physical being with a human form, then the rituals and sacraments of the Church would be meaningless. If salvation came through secret knowledge rather than faith, then the authority of the priesthood would be undermined. And if every human being had a divine spark within them, then the social hierarchy of the time would be turned on its head. For the early church, the Gnostics were a threat to the very foundations of their faith, and so they did everything they could to suppress their teachings. The first recorded mention of Abraxas comes from a letter written by the Church Father Irenaeus of Lyons in the early 3rd century. In this letter, Irenaeus warns his readers about the Gnostic heresy and specifically mentions their belief in a physical God who can be accessed through secret knowledge. He does not give a lot of detail, but he clearly identifies Abraxas as one of the figures central to this heresy. Another early source that mentions Abraxas is the work known as the Pistis Sophia, which is a collection of Gnostic texts dating back to the 4th century. In this text, Abraxas is depicted as a kind of divine emanation, a being who comes forth from the depths of the non-being and brings light into existence. He is also described as the one who creates the world, the one who brings forth all things. In other words, the Gnostics saw Abraxas as the creator of the material world, but not in the way that we might normally think of creation. For them, creation was not an act of bringing something new into existence, but rather an act of revealing what already was. Abraxas was not a god of innovation, but a god of recognition. He brought humanity to the knowledge of their true nature. Just as the sun reveals the colors of the rainbow on a rainy day, despite the efforts of the Church to suppress them, Gnostic texts like the Pistis Sophia survived and were eventually rediscovered. In the early 20th century, scholars have been able to piece together a fairly complete picture of Gnostic theology and the place of Abraxas in it. But what makes him so fascinating is not just his theological significance, but also the mystery that surrounds him. We don't know for sure where he came from or why he was so important to the Gnostics. All we have are the scraps of information that the Church Fathers left us, and the few Gnostic texts that survived the centuries. It's possible that Abraxas was based on a real historical figure, a Jewish sage or apocalyptic prophet who lived sometime in the 1st or 2nd century AD, but ultimately we can't know for sure. And that's part of what makes him so appealing. He represents a lost world of religious thought and practice that we can never fully know, but only speculate about. There are a number of theories about who or what Abraxas was, but ultimately the truth is that we may never know for sure. What we do know is that he was a powerful symbol for the Gnostics, a representation of the divine spark that each person possesses. He was the embodiment of their religious and spiritual yearnings, and he continues to inspire people today with his mystery and power. So while the church may have tried to erase him from history, Abraxas lives on in the hearts and minds of those who seek the truth. So what do you think? Is there anything we missed? Let us know in the comments below. Their verdict, excommunication, and we know them as the Ebionites, the Cephians, and the Marcosians, followers of Simon Magus. They all shared one thing in common, that they preached a form of early Christianity that didn't fit into the mold of what the church hierarchy wanted. We also know them as Gnostics, but one of these groups really irked the church fathers. They were called Abrahamites after their leader, someone who goes by the name of Abraxas or Abraxas. He was a Jewish-born Christian preacher active in the mid-2nd century in the Roman province of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Very little is known about him. The only source for his life is a letter written by the Bishop Irenaeus of Lugdunum in 180. In it, Irenaeus describes how Abraxas came onto this scene preaching a kind of Christianity that made converts quickly, lots of converts, so many, in fact, that he drew the attention of the Roman governor, who then summoned Irenaeus to come deal with this upstart. And what exactly was so dangerous about Abraxas in the eyes of the Christian church? What did Abraxas teach? Did he start his own religion? Was he an anti-Jewish prophet? Or was he just a guy who got really popular and thus attracted the ire of the authorities? If you've watched my videos before, you know that the traditional narrative of church history has it that early Christianity was a monolithic block. All the various groups that today bear different names under the heading of early Christianity, Marcionites, Gnostics, Montanists, etc., all basically accepted the core teachings of Paul of Tarsus, and in fact, it was only when the church gained power that it then spent the next several centuries condemning everybody else and declaring itself the sole inheritor of the true Christian tradition. This narrative has some merit. Yes, the church did spend a lot of time arguing with various folks, but it also changed quite a bit from the 2nd century to the 4th century. A good example is the shift in the understanding of what constituted being Christian. The early church wasn't really organized like it is now. The notion of clerical celibacy didn't exist. Priests could be married. The idea that clergy should not work for money also didn't exist. And that goes for deacons, priests, and bishops alike. Bishops weren't necessarily superior to priests. They were just fuller. Think of it more like a sales manager at McDonald's. He's not a better fry cook, just a more experienced one. Now, yes, there were bishops in the 1st century, but they weren't considered higher than other clergy, and that will become important later. Ignatius of Antioch is a good example of a 2nd century bishop. He wrote letters to churches in the province of Asia Minor, mostly telling them to mind their own business and stop trying to meddle in the affairs of the church in Rome. He even chides the church in Philadelphia for receiving widows who fled to them because of persecution in the neighboring city of Antioch. Why? Because Ignatius says the church should be feeding these people, not sheltering them. This was not because he disliked the persecuted Christians, but because he believed that the local churches should take care of their own poor. If they needed help, then the church in Rome would send them aid. But no bishop in Rome shouldn't tell them how to do things. In fact, Ignatius himself was on his way to Rome to be executed when he wrote these letters, and while he did have authority over the churches he visited, he never claimed to be infallible. These are very important things to remember when considering what happened to Abraxas. So now let's look at what Irenaeus said about him. In his letter to the church in Rome, he described how the sect of the Abrahamites was started by someone who was originally a Jew. He then became a Christian, but eventually left the church and began preaching his own version of Christianity. Irenaeus claims that the reason for leaving was because the man couldn't stand the virgin birth narrative. To quote Irenaeus directly, he does not confess that the Lord was made of a virgin, but maintains that he was made in the ordinary way, being born according to the course of nature, like other men. Now, if that's true, then we can say that Abraxas was probably a member of one of the Jewish Christian sects, perhaps the Ebionites. If you recall, they were excommunicated in 314, along with the Sethians and Marcionites, but they continued to exist outside the church for several centuries. How long? We don't know. For our purposes, it's important to note two things about the Ebionite movement. First, its existence proves that the rejection of the virgin birth narrative was a major issue. Second, the Ebionites were still considered Christians, at least by Irenaeus, since he pits them against the Valentinian Gnostics. What's important to notice here is that although Irenaeus claims the Abrahamites rejected the virgin birth narrative, he doesn't claim that they rejected Jesus. Furthermore, he lumps them in with the Gnostics, not the Jews. That might seem like a small distinction, but it's very important. The Gnostics weren't considered heretics yet. Not until the Council of Arles in 397 did the official condemnation begin. The reason for the delay is simple. The Gnostics were too Christian for the Church to consider them a separate religion. The main problem the Church had with them was how they interpreted the term gnosis. To the Gnostics, gnosis meant secret knowledge, specifically about how to attain salvation. Irenaeus argued that the secret knowledge was actually Scripture, and that any teaching that went against Scripture wasn't true knowledge. However, for the Gnostics, the Bible wasn't Scripture. It was simply a collection of writings that contained bits of gnosis. For example, the Gospel of Thomas is a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. Scholars estimate that it was written around 140. Although that's hotly debated, it looks nothing like the canonical Gospels. There are no birth narratives, no parables, no crucifixion, no resurrection. It's just a collection of 114 sayings. It was originally written in Aramaic, not Greek, and while it is indeed Christian, it reads more like a philosophy book than a religious text. However, because of its Aramaic original, it likely circulated within Jewish Christian circles. And that's important because it shows that the Gnostics weren't a monolithic group. Each sect had its own beliefs, and for whatever reason, they all used the term gnosis to describe their system of beliefs. We know that the Gnostics generally believed that the world was created by a lesser god, a kind of demiurge, and that this god was ignorant, jealous, and cruel. They believed that the soul was imprisoned in the body, and that this imprisonment caused suffering. Salvation came when the spark of divine gnosis ignited in the human soul, and this allowed the soul to recognize its true nature, which was pure spirit. So again, the Gnostics were a collection of disparate groups who all believed that they had attained secret knowledge, and that knowledge taught them that the God of Israel wasn't the highest God. Rather, there was a supreme God beyond the comprehension of humans, and that supreme God had sent Jesus to reveal that truth. Abraxas may have been one such teacher, but that's not certain. The only reason we connect him to Gnosticism is because Irenaeus does. But nowhere in Irenaeus's writings does he define what Gnosticism is. He just uses the word to describe the various groups he disagrees with. Furthermore, nowhere does he claim that Abraxas was the founder of any kind of Gnostic sect. What we have from Irenaeus is simply the claim that a Jewish Christian named Abraxas broke away from the church because of the virgin birth narrative. If that's all he meant, then calling Abraxas a Gnostic isn't really accurate. The problem is that most scholars assume that Irenaeus used the term Gnostic as a synonym for heretic, and because he grouped Abraxas in with the Gnostics, we assume Abraxas was a Gnostic. But maybe Irenaeus was simply saying that Abraxas was a heretic who claimed to have special knowledge that allowed him to reject the virgin birth narrative. He could have been a Jewish Christian like the Ebionites, or he could have been a Jewish preacher who claimed to have special knowledge about God. In either case, we don't really know what Abraxas taught. We only know that he founded a movement that had a charismatic leader and lots of followers. And this is where we get into the real problem for Abraxas. The problem wasn't that he taught a certain theology, or that he rejected certain parts of the developing Christian orthodoxy. The problem was that he was wildly popular. This caused Irenaeus and the church in Rome to write him off as a heretic who started his own church, a heretic who attracted lots of followers, a heretic who caused the local church to split into. And this last point is the most important. If we follow Irenaeus, it seems like the church in Rome was struggling to keep up with the growth of Christianity. Bishop after bishop complained about how fast the religion was growing, and in most cases, it was seen as a good thing, but not always. Sometimes the new Christians were trouble. The problem was that the new converts didn't understand what it meant to be Christian. They thought it meant they were automatically saved, and this led to scandalous behavior. Irenaeus himself addresses this issue in his letter to the church in Rome. He chastises them for giving money to traveling preachers and warns them not to trust those who preach to them. It seems that the church in Rome was having problems with false teachers, and it's entirely possible that they saw Abraxas as another one of those false teachers. What exactly he taught isn't important. The fact that he attracted large crowds was enough to make him an enemy of the church. This is really important to remember when studying early Christianity. Much like today, the church in the 2nd century was largely concerned with maintaining order. Yes, they had theological disputes with various groups, but they also had to deal with keeping people in line. And what caused people to leave the fold was far more concerning to them than what people were teaching in the synagogues. But once the church silenced Abraxas, the problem was solved. the local churches could go back to normal. They didn't have to worry about who this Abraxas guy was or what he was teaching. They just knew that he was causing problems. So the next time you read an article or watch a video claiming that Abraxas was a Gnostic prophet whose teachings were suppressed by the early church, remember that we only know that Abraxas was called a heretic by one bishop. We don't know what his theology was, nor do we know why he was so threatening to the church in Rome. All we know is that he was a charismatic leader who attracted a large following, and that's really the only reason Irenaeus felt the need to write him off. Today we're going to talk about Abraxas in art and literature. There are other videos on this channel which cover Abraxas more extensively, such as our video on Abraxas, the Gnostic god of light, and our video on the history of Abraxas, so do check them out if you'd like to learn more about Abraxas. But today we will just focus on Abraxas in art and literature. So let's start off with some of the most famous depictions of Abraxas in ancient art. The earliest surviving image of Abraxas is found on a stone coffin discovered in the ancient Roman city of Dura, Europos in 1929. Dura Europos was an important stop on the Silk Road, a cosmopolitan city inhabited by Jews, Christians, pagans, Zoroastrians, and others, and on this coffin we can see that Abraxas is depicted in a way that mirrors the supreme deity of each of these religions, Yahweh, Zeus, Mithra, and Amazes. He has 4 faces and 8 wings, but only 3 of the faces and 5 of the wings are visible, because the stone coffin lid is tilted at an angle. On his chest is a cross, perhaps representing Christianity, and above him is a crescent moon with 1 point facing down, perhaps representing Islam, or perhaps simply the horns of a boar. In his right hand he holds a flower or a flame, and in his left hand a whip. The veil covering his rear end may be a reference to his name, which might have originally been spelled Alpha Omega, signifying that he was the beginning and the end. The second example of ancient art depicting Abraxas comes from the excavations at Xenopolis in Turkey in 1976. Here, Abraxas is shown enthroned with a snake in his right hand and a sword in his left. In this sculpture, he has only 2 wings, but 6 of his heads are visible. The heads may symbolize the directions he is looking in, and also may represent the 6 days of creation before the Sabbath. Next, we come to a fragment of a fresco from Dura Europos, this time showing Abraxas riding a crocodile. Again, we can see 4 of his heads and 4 of his wings, and it appears that there would have been a 5th head on the other side of the crocodile. This image reinforces the connections between Abraxas and the world of magic. For many people in antiquity, crocodiles were associated with magic and sorcery, which is why it was considered a dangerous animal to handle. For example, when Pliny the Elder wrote about crocodiles, he said, "They are produced from putrefaction and the contagion of marshes. They are bred of serpents and fish eggs laid in mud, and from bodies buried in swamps." Even though such theories about the origin of crocodiles were obviously wrong, they reinforced the idea that crocodiles had something to do with the occult. Moreover, since Abraxas was a divine magic Ian, it makes sense that he would be shown with magical creatures like crocodiles. Finally, we have a few examples of amulets and gems engraved with Abraxas. These serve as good examples of how people viewed Abraxas as a protective figure who could ward off evil spirits. You can see that Abraxas is either shown as a frontal head or a head emerging from a snake. In both cases, the creature behind Abraxas symbolizes chaos and evil. However, the all-seeing eye of Abraxas reveals that he is aware of everything that is happening and that he has the power to protect those who invoke him. So we can see in these pieces of art that Abraxas was often depicted as having multiple faces, heads or wings. He was seen as a powerful, protective deity who could ward off evil and chaos, and that he was known for his wisdom and his ability to see all things. Now let's look at some examples of Abraxas in modern literature, music, and film. It is amazing how widespread the figure of Abraxas has become in modern times. He is a symbol of mystery and intrigue and the unknown, and he continues to fascinate us even today. Let's begin with Carlos Castaneda's series of books, which helped popularize Abraxas in the West. Castaneda claimed to have learned about Abraxas from his mentor, a Yaqui Indian named Don Juan Matis. In Castaneda's book, Abraxas represents the force of chaos and destruction, but also the force of creation and illumination. Don Juan taught Carlos that Abraxas was the supreme ruler of the universe, the ultimate reality underlying all phenomena, and that he could be reached through dreaming and hallucinatory states of consciousness. Of course, it turned out that Carlos Castaneda had actually invented Don Juan and many of the teachings attributed to him, including the teachings on Abraxas. But nevertheless, Castaneda's writings did introduce many people to the idea of Abraxas and had a profound influence on Western esotericism. In the 1970s, the heavy metal band Black Sabbath released a song called Iron Man about a man who discovers the location of an alien spacecraft and accidentally activates it. In the process, Iron Man becomes possessed by the spirit of Abraxas, who demands that Iron Man build him a new body so that he can walk among the humans. While the original version of the song does not contain any lyrics about Abraxas, later versions of the song do. The story of Iron Man has resonated with many people over the years, and the character has become one of the most iconic in comic book history. Another heavy metal band, Judas Priest, released a song called The Sentinel about a mysterious guardian who protects the entrance to the underworld. The Sentinel is said to be invincible, but one day he is slain by a warrior named Ronaldo. When Ronaldo approaches the body of the Sentinel to finish him off, the Sentinel speaks to Ronaldo and tells him that his name is Abraxas. Once again, we see Abraxas connected with the realm of the dead. Next we have the movie adaptation of Ken Kesey's novel Sometimes a Great Notion. In the film, Abraxas is the name of a huge bull that is revered as a kind of god by the Native American characters. The character of Henry Stamba refuses to kill the bull because he believes that it is sacred. Unfortunately, the bull ends up being killed anyway, and this event serves as a catalyst for the spiritual awakening of Henry Stamba. Another film that features Abraxas is Disney's animated Robin Hood. In the film, Abraxas is the name of a group of bandits led by the evil Prince John. The group is never referred to as Abraxas in the film. But in the credits, finally, we have the game God of War, in which Abraxas is the final boss. As the god of war, Kratos is tasked with killing Abraxas to prevent him from bringing about the apocalypse. As you can see, Abraxas is a very popular figure in modern literature and entertainment. He is often portrayed as a powerful, mysterious, and sometimes evil figure, but always one who should be revered and respected. In this episode, we are going to talk about the legacy of Abraxas, but before we do that, if you have not done so already, I encourage you to subscribe and join our ever-growing community of seekers and lovers of esoteric wisdom. And now let us begin. There is perhaps no other symbol of Gnosticism more recognized than Abraxas. From medieval manuscripts to modern posters, this strange creature with a head like an owl and a body covered in wings and snake-like tails has become one of the most recognizable symbols of alternative spirituality. And despite the fact that his name appears only once in the Nag Hammadi texts, he has managed to capture the imagination of millions of people across the globe. So what is it about this strange Gnostic deity that continues to fascinate us so much? Well, that is exactly what we are going to try to find out in this episode. It was mentioned in episode 2 that the term Abraxas is actually a Greek rendering of the name of the supreme Gnostic deity, a name that when translated into Greek letters becomes Iao, Sabaoth. It is also important to mention here that many scholars agree that the name is ultimately derived from a Hebrew root meaning father. In the 1st century CE, the Jewish philosopher Rabbi Akiva taught that God revealed his tetragrammaton name to Abraham, which is why later in Jewish tradition, the tetragrammaton was rendered as Adonai, or Yahweh, and the name Iao is thought by some to be a corruption of the name Yod, Her, Vav, Her, or YHVH. But whether or not this is true, the idea about Abraxas represents a kind of paternal divine consciousness pervades much of Gnostic thought. For example, in the trimorphic Protenoia, Abraxas is called the perfect, invisible, incomprehensible, boundless, ineffable, immortal, uncircumscribed light, the depth of all, the source of all, the origin of life, the Father of all, the Spirit of truth, the Revealer of all, the Knower of all, the Savior of all, and the Lord of all. This passage is interesting because it shows how even early Christians who were familiar with the Hebrew Bible could adapt these texts to fit their own theological understanding. In this case, they took a name that originally belonged to the God of Israel and made it their own by imbuing it with new meanings and associations. In the same text, we learn that the emanation of the first of the eons, Bauia, bore witness to Abraxas, saying, "Behold, I have brought forth a son in your image and likeness, that you may give him the fullness of your being." And so Abraxas gave his name to his son, who became known as Jesus Christ. In other words, Jesus was seen as the embodiment of the Father's name, just as the Tetragrammaton was believed to be the actual name of God himself. And just as Jesus was called the Christ, the Anointed One, he was also called the Abraxas, the Father's very essence. In fact, the connection between Jesus and Abraxas is so close that in some texts they are even identified with each other. For example, in the secret book of John, We read, Jesus said to them, "He who has known the Father has known me. For I am he who was over all things, and beside all things, the first and last, hidden and open, the beginning and the end. And I am the mystery in the Holy of Holies." And in the Gospel of Philip, we read, Jesus said, "Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." And again, he said, "Let him who seeks the depths understand the shallows, for it is from the depths that the shallows have been made." And again, Jesus spoke to his disciples in parables, and said to them, "The kingdom of the blessed, the great, the glorious, heavenly, spiritual, holy, eternal, immortal Father is like this. He who understands, let him understand." So as you can see, there is a clear link between Jesus and Abraxas in Gnostic thought, and this link has only become stronger in the centuries since Gnosticism first emerged. Now, as mentioned at the start of this episode, the name Abraxas only appears once in the Nag Hammadi texts, specifically in the trimorphic Protenoia. Yet despite this, he has become one of the most iconic figures in the pantheon of Gnostic deities. Why is this the case? Well, one possible explanation is that Abraxas was simply a more popular deity in the ancient world than his Gnostic counterpart, Jov Sabaoth. As we discussed in episode 2, there was never one single Gnostic system of beliefs, but rather a variety of different Gnostic sects, each with their own particular doctrines and practices, and it is likely that some of these sects venerated certain deities more than others. For example, in the trimorphic Protenoia, Abraxas is clearly a more important figure than the other Gnostic eons, such as Biba, Aua, and Zaka. His image is used on the cover of the book, and he is the only one who is given a full description. This suggests that Abraxas was seen as the supreme Gnostic deity by the author of this particular text, and it is entirely possible that other Gnostic sects did the same. However, this is only speculation, and we cannot say for sure why Abraxas became such an important figure in Gnosticism. What we can say with certainty is that he has remained an important figure in Western esotericism ever since. The earliest surviving image of Abraxas comes from a marble relief found at the Temple of Isis in Pompeii. The relief dates back to the 1st century CE and shows Isis enthroned with a winged, snake-tailed figure kneeling before her. Most scholars agree that this figure is Abraxas. However, the exact nature of his relationship to Isis is not known. Some scholars believe that he is her consort, while others think that he is simply one of her attendants. Regardless, this relief demonstrates that Abraxas was already a well-known figure in the ancient world, even outside of Christian circles. From the 4th century onwards, we start seeing Abraxas depicted as a Christian demon. This is due to the fact that Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire and began actively persecuting pagans. When this happened, many pagans were forced to convert to Christianity or go into hiding. As a result, much of their religious iconography was demonized and appropriated by the new faith. Abraxas was one of the deities who suffered this fate. He was seen as a demon in medieval bestiaries and grimoires, and his image was used to ward off evil spirits. However, this did not stop the esoteric traditions from continuing to venerate Abraxas as a divine being. The Renaissance saw a renewed interest in classical antiquity, and with it came a renewed interest in Abraxas. He was depicted in paintings by artists such as Francisco Goya and William Blake, and his image was used by alchemists and Rosicrucians. In the modern era, Abraxas has become a symbol of rebellion and individual freedom. His association with Gnosticism has led some to see him as a representative of the human spirit's desire for enlightenment and liberation from ignorance. Others see him as a symbol of the occult and the hidden mysteries of the universe, and still others simply appreciate his mysterious and enigmatic nature. Whatever the reason, there is no denying that Abraxas continues to capture the imagination of people all over the world. So let us conclude this episode by saying that Abraxas is a complex and controversial figure whose origins and meaning are still debated by scholars today. His story is a reminder that the ancient world was far more complex than we often give it credit for, and that the lines between good and evil, between paganism and Christianity, were not always as clear-cut as we might think. In a world that is increasingly dominated by rigid dogmatism and intolerance, Abraxas reminds us of the importance of open-mindedness, tolerance, and a willingness to engage with the wisdom of different cultures and religions. He is a symbol of the human spirit's desire for enlightenment and liberation from ignorance, and as such, he continues to inspire and intrigue people all over the world. This brings us to the end of this episode on the legacy of Abraxas. We hope that you enjoyed learning more about this fascinating figure, and that you have been able to apply his lessons to your own life. If you want to dive deeper into the subject matter, we highly recommend checking out the additional resources that we have linked in the description below. Thank you for watching, and may you continue to seek wisdom in all of your endeavors.